Attention, all curious minds, innovators, and trendsetters. It's time to pause, lean in, and get ready for an extraordinary journey as we dive deep into the fascinating realms of life, technology, entertainment, and business. Let's explore, learn, and grow together. Brace yourselves, for the next thrilling episodes of Hipther Talks is about to take off. Counting down from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here we go.
Hi everyone, Zoltan here. We're back again this week at Hipther Talks, and I don't know what happened, but this November I'm somehow not the host of our podcast. This is already the third episode in which I'm just sitting in the background, listening to the experts, and of course learning all new things. But I have the pleasure of having Andreea Dobre. She has some initials behind her name, CIA, CRMA, but she's also the head of internal audit at Greentube. But yeah, Andrea will probably tell you what that CIA and CRMA means in her short intro. So yeah, we have this tradition here on Hipther Talks that we give the opportunity for our guests to share a few words about themselves. So Andrea, before you start the presentation, could you share a few words about your background?
Sure, of course. Hello, everybody. So like Zoltan said, my name is Andreea Dobre. I'm the head of the internal audit department at Greentube, and I do have the funny letters behind my name, which are really the only reason why I did them was so I can put CIA behind my name. But it actually means that it's a certification. So I'm a certified internal auditor. And I'm also holding a certification in risk management assurance. So I can audit risk management concepts and frameworks and things like that. I have over 11 years of experience in the online gambling industry from an operational perspective and from a regulatory compliance perspective. So yeah, it's a lot of knowledge and a lot of certifications put in the whole thing.
All right, so those of you who are listening to this podcast, you should head over to YouTube, search for Hipther Talks, and also maybe add in the gray zone, or just head to youtube.com/HiptherTV and you can find the latest episodes because there's a presentation on the screen which you might want to check out, which will be, of course, during this whole episode. So, Andrea, I will cut my microphone and video and leave this to you and get back once you are finished with the presentation. I'm really curious about it too, by the way.
Thank you, Zoltan. Thank you so much. So the presentation is about in the grade zone, navigating the three lines model in practice. Now, not a lot of people are aware of the three lines model, and this is basically a concept that is published by the Institute of Internal Auditors to offer organizations a structured way of assigning accountabilities and responsibilities with regards to risk, right? So which function within your department should do what, right? But before we go into this model further, let's discuss risk and risk management. First of all, what is risk, right? Most people define risk as a threat to their business, but that's not the case. Risk can be defined as an uncertainty that can impact your business. This means that risk can be both a threat and an opportunity. For example, AI can bring a few threats to the business, of course, from a data security perspective, for example, but it might also bring opportunities, just like we all know, right? Let's take a quick journey through the evolution of risk management, right? Because understanding where we've come from helps us see why framework like the three lines model are so important today. Right. So we have the early days, which can be defined as survival and intuition. We have the industrial era, process and rules. We have the 20th century, where the enterprise risk management took place. And we have the modern era, which is integrated and dynamic. That's how the risk management is defined during the modern era. And let's go a little bit through all of these different stages of development, right? So back in the day, risk management was all about survival. If you didn't avoid the danger, or if you didn't play nicely with your neighbors, bad things happened. Religion, customs, and moral rules acted as controls, basically telling people, do this or else. It was informal and instinctive, but it worked at those times, right? Now, fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, things got bigger and more complicated. Factories, supply chains, payrolls, suddenly winging it wasn't enough. Businesses needed rules, they needed procedures, and formal internal controls. Operational and financial risks were now a serious business. So if a factory exploded, for example, the consequences were bigger. Yeah. Then came the era of enterprise risk management. The realization that risks are connected. You couldn't just manage finance in one corner and operations in another. ERM gave us frameworks, compliance functions, and audits. Think of it as risk management with a bird's eye view, seeing all the dominoes in place before they fall. And today, risk management should be more or less everywhere, integrated into strategy, culture, and technology. We've got dashboards, predictive analytics, and cross-functional teams talking to each other in real time. The focus is on resilience, is on ESG, and protecting trust. Basically, we've gone from avoiding tigers to avoiding PR disasters, regulatory fines, and cyber crisis. And we do it with data, not just instinctively, right? So risk management has evolved from instinctive survival to strategic data-driven decision-making, and it continues to adapt to a fast-changing world, right? There is no doubt that risk management failed to prevent global events like, for example, the financial crisis. The failure was, however, due to inability of organizations to apply effective risk management processes and procedures, rather than inherent defects in the risk management as a discipline. The financial crisis, together with current global issues in high-risk areas such as health and safety, environmental, technological, political, and regulatory sectors, resulted in the creation of further regulations demanding organizations to implement risk assessment frameworks, or at least ensure the effective performance of their internal control system. Right? And this also prompted the improvement of different enterprise risk management frameworks. Let's take a look at a couple of them. Yeah. There are two well-known organizations that have come up with their own enterprise risk management frameworks. And this will help us understand how the risk management process in itself stays within the overall enterprise risk management framework. Now, these are quite complicated, quite complex, but I just want you to have a look at them to understand, again, how the risk management process falls under it and how we've moved from that instinctive or that siloed approach to a more bird's eye view. Right. So we'll start with the Committee of Sponsoring Organization of the Tradeway Commission, COSO, with their framework, the ERM Cube, which was developed in 2004. Now, it states that an effective enterprise risk management is done by implementing the 8 different components of risk management. So we can see there the internal environment, objective setting, event identification, risk assessment, risk response, control activities, information and communication and monitoring, all these 8 components. And it's integrated within the 4 different types of objectives, which is strategic, operational, reporting, and compliance. And it's supposed to be embedded at all levels within a business, at all functions, at entity level, division, business unit, and subsidiary. Then in 2017, the same organization came up with a different framework named the Helix. Now, this is more complex. It has 5 components, which you can see below: governance and culture, strategy and objective setting, performance, review and revision, and information communication and reporting. Those are the 5 components, which then they're divided further into 20 principles. Now, the Cube manages risks across the business, but the Helix starts with strategy, focusing on the risks that could stop us from achieving our objectives, making risk management more forward-looking and value-driven. Now, another organization that have come up with their own ERM framework is the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, and it's the ISO 31000, right? So ISO 31000 can be seen as combining the strains of both the cube and the helix, but in a principle-based flexible framework. So what good risk management looks like, we can see it throughout the principles. What is needed to support effective risk management, so we can see the framework, and then how to implement it, and that is the process clause number 6. Now, the ISO 31000 emphasizes structured, systematic risk management, like we could see in the cube, and encourages a strategic forward-looking perspective, like we can see in the helix. But ISO is more adaptable than the COSO frameworks, meaning it can be applied to any organization, any type of risk, at any level. As we can see in the cube, it's quite defined: subsidiary, business unit, division, entity level. But the ISO does not really define the levels. It can be applied as you wish, as it is better for your company. Now, it's very important, and this is where we can see how the risk management process falls into the enterprise risk management framework, because we can see here, let me put in, laser pointer, we can see here, this is actually the risk management process, and the enterprise risk management framework is the whole concept, including the principle, including the framework, including the process. The same for the cube. The risk management process is just these steps here within the cube. But the enterprise risk management framework provides you a full overview, oversight of the entire company. And same it goes for Helix. We can see it in the performance component. If we go further, we can understand how the risk management process is. And we can see that the risk management process is the same across all of the frameworks, or at least it can be grouped to follow the same set of steps. Okay. So we can see we have defined context and objectives. You have to understand your company. You have to understand different stakeholders and your objectives before you even start considering what are the risks that can affect them. You need to assess the risks that can impact your objectives. You need to manage those risks, and you monitor, review, and report. Always assessing new emerging risks or controls that can change the way that they work and no longer apply to bring that risk down, right? So let's see how the 3 different frameworks look in this context. We have here ISO 31000, the cube, and the helix, right? So we can see scope, context, criteria. For ISO, for the cube, we have internal environment and objective setting. COSO Helix, we have governance and culture, strategy, and objective setting. So we can see as we go down that all these 3 frameworks follow almost the same steps when it comes to the risk management. It's just a matter of the language that they use and the different steps, whether they can be more granular or whether they contain an entire step within just one step. Now, actually, a very fun way to explain the entire enterprise risk management process, and something that I've learned during my current certification that I'm currently doing, which is the certification on enterprise risk management by the Institute of Risk Management. This is how I learned to define it. So ERM should be embedded in stock, needs to be paced, aims to be made so that the benefits can be seen in firm. And that should basically explain everything about the enterprise risk management, right? So let me explain a little bit further. Enterprise risk management should be embedded in strategy, in tactical, so how you apply that strategy, in operational and compliance objectives. It needs to be paced, so it needs to be proportionate to the risks that the company faces. It needs to be aligned within all of the departments. It needs to be comprehensive, so it takes all of the risks into consideration. It needs to be embedded into the decision-making process. That's where it actually makes a difference. It needs to be dynamic, always aware of what risks can emerge, especially in such a changing environment, in such a changing landscape. that we are facing right now. It aims to be made, so it needs to cover all of the mandatory compliance regulations, etc., that are out there. It needs to provide assurance, so we are sure that we're covering the risks, or we are sure that we're taking this amount of risk that is acceptable for our company. It needs to, again, be embedded within the decision-making aspect. So it needs to impact what decisions are being made. The decisions needs to take into consideration the risk. And it needs to be effective and efficient, right? It needs to change the process and make it more effective and more efficient so that we can see the benefits at financial level, at infrastructure level, at reputational level, and at marketing level. Good. Let's continue. Right, so now we're going to the 3 lines model. Let's explain more what the 3 lines model is. Right, so we see an umbrella. We have the shaft, we have the canopy, and we have the handle, right? I had to actually Google the actual words and components of an umbrella. So yes, this is the handle, the shaft, and the canopy. And then we have our objective. This umbrella is supposed to protect our objectives, right? So how do we use the 3 lines model to do that? The shaft itself is the canopy, it's our internal control system. So all of the controls that we put in place to ensure that our objectives are being made and that we mitigate the risk scenarios in a way that it is decided by the company. And then we have all of this range that's supposed to be the risks. Right. We have the first line from the 3 lines. These are the risk owners. They identify the risk. They implement and use controls and procedures to ensure their effectiveness and mitigation of risk, right? That's that internal control system. So your first line of defense is the internal control system. Then you have the second line, and that's the shaft. That's the compliance and risk management department. And they review and they challenge the ICS, the internal control system. They interpret rules, they provide training and advises the business on regulations and the effectiveness of the implemented controls when covering emerging risks, right? New regulations, politics, etc. Whatever could mean an emerging risks in today's landscape. And then we have the third line, which is audit and assurance. And this is the internal audit, for example, or external audit. And they evaluate the effectiveness of the risk management framework through a systematic and evidence-based process. Right? And these always discuss amongst each other. We can also see the 3 lines model and the way that they communicate with each other, because this is a very important part of it, is how the risk information flows from one function to another. So we have the governing body, which is the management board. We have management, which is the first lines and the second line roles, the operational functions, as well as the compliance and risk management functions. And we have the internal audit and the external assurance providers. So between the first line and the second line roles, we can see that they stay within the management, and the third line roles within internal audit. And then here we're able to see how they communicate. So there's always a circular movement of information, of accountability reporting, of delegation, direction, and alignment, coordination, and collaboration. Okay, let's go and see how the 3 lines can fail, because even though it's quite clear in the way that it works, it's very easy to implement it in a way that it fails, right? So we can take into consideration the Halifax Bank of Scotland case example. This is a major UK banking group that was formed in 2001 from the merger of Halifax and the Bank of Scotland. And they collapsed after engaging in aggressive and high-risk lending, failing to manage liquidity and credit risks, and lacking effective board oversight. The bank's risk management and governance shortcomings left it exposed during the 2008 financial crisis, ultimately necessitating government broker takeover by Lloyd's and resulting in significant losses for shareholders, right? So let's see how the 3 lines failed in this case. We have the first line is the business management. The second line is risk and compliance. And the third line is internal audit and board. Right? So the business management, they ignored risk limits and they pursued sales at all costs, very aggressive commercially, right? They had an overexposure to risky mortgages. That's how they felt. The second line, the risk function lacked authority and warning was not acted upon, right? So dismissal after raising concerns. The internal audit and the board failed because they failed to provide effective challenge and they had a lack of independence. So they failed to hold management accountable. Now we have a second case, which is Intain. And Ostrak sued Intain for failing to prevent money laundering, potential fines up to $22.2 million. The regulator alleged that Intain failed to implement a compliant AML program, obscured the identities of high-risk customers, and did not effectively monitor suspicious transactions, including large deposits and bets from foreign countries. These failures exposed the company to potential multi-million-dollar civil penalties and highlighted significant gaps in its compliance framework. Right. So let's see the third lines. Right, we have business management, risk and compliance, internal audit, and board. So the first line failed to escalate unusual activity, and they had ineffective control. So the frontline staff in this case and account managers failed to flag high-risk betting and pseudonymous accounts. The second line, they failed to enforce policies and failed to monitor risks. So AML policies weren't enforced, and high-risk activity went unmonitored on the second line. And the third line, they failed to identify gaps and they failed to recommend corrective actions, right? So audits missed control gaps and didn't recommend fixes. So we can see what happens when the three lines fail, right? So now let's see what they shouldn't do in order to make sure that they are effective, that the model is implemented effective, right? So the operational management. They should not rely on second or third lines to identify and manage risks. They shouldn't misrepresent information related to controls. They shouldn't bypass controls in pursuit of efficiency. They shouldn't disregard feedback raised by the second and third lines. They shouldn't rely solely on past practices or historical data without considering emerging risks. As we've actually seen it happen, there's always that expression, but we've always done it like this. The compliance management, they shouldn't perform operational activities. They need to be independent and they need to have an objective view of what's happening. And they cannot have that if they are involved in executing the task. They shouldn't dictate controls or practices without the consultation of the first line. It's very important because the first line is the experts when it comes to the execution of the tasks or the controls. They shouldn't compromise their objectivity, and they shouldn't restrict or impede business operations without valid and well-justified reasons. They shouldn't avoid regular review and reassessment. And they shouldn't assume that because they did an assessment a year ago, the controls are behaving the same way or the risks are still the same. Now, the third line of defense, internal audit, they shouldn't be involved in the execution or management of risks. They shouldn't implement corrective measures. We can recommend them for sure, but we cannot implement them. Otherwise, we won't be able to audit them at a later time in an objective way. We shouldn't prioritize our own agenda. Taking over the world, we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't assume management responsibilities or decision-making authority. And we shouldn't downplay risks or control failures. And we shouldn't own responsibility for rectifying the findings. Now, we're just going to go through a small exercise on line identification. So I'm going to put some responsibilities that could belong to the first, second, or third line of from the model. So let's go with the first one. Monitoring player activity or signs of problem gambling. That is the first line. It's something that they execute as a control that is being implemented and handled by the first line. Managing player accounts and transactions, first line. Ensuring responsible gambling measures are in place, This can be first line and second line because they can see things from different perspectives. The first line sees it from an operational perspective, and the second line sees it from a compliance perspective or risk assurance. Ensuring compliance with data protection and privacy regulations, this is the second line. Conducting periodic compliance audits and assessment, this can be the second line because they can conduct compliance audits. Just because it's an audit, that doesn't mean that it falls under the third line of defense. Reviewing and updating the anti-money laundering program, that's the second line. Evaluating the adherence to internal policies and procedures, that's the second line. Conducting independent compliance audits and reporting discrepancies, that's the third line. The difference between the second and the third line is the third line does not have any responsibilities when it comes to the implementation of controls, and our only responsibility is to report to the board or senior management of how the situation is actually looking like and how we are protecting ourselves or how we are mitigating the risks. Monitoring of platform and technical configurations to ensure that these work as intended, that's the first line. Ensuring that the application of processes is done in accordance with procedure, that's the first line. Ensuring that processes are implemented to mitigate risks, that's the first line. And monitoring the regulatory ecosystem and keep the rest of the company informed of any upcoming changes, that is the first line. Great. Right, and just some optional board responsibilities, right? So what do? They approve AML policies, they review compliance audit results, they ensure company response to regulatory changes, they oversee internal audit and assurance processes, and they set risk appetite and strategic compliance priorities. Now, let's consider when things go wrong, right? When there are unclear roles and responsibilities, when there's inefficient risk reporting, when there's a failure to integrate risk management, when there's a lack of risk ownership, when there's a limited risk appetite understanding, when there's an overemphasis on past events, when there's a limited integration of risk data and systems. Yeah. So most of these things, the three lines model aims to correct or aims to help with. And also the inadequate risk prioritization. Yeah. So lines of defense, take-home reflection. I wanted to leave you with a few questions that you could ask yourself regarding the way that your organization works. Right. So one, do we have absolute clarity on who owns which risks and where accountability begins and ends across the three lines? How can the first, second, and third lines work together more fluidly to anticipate risks rather than react to them? Are people in each line equipped and empowered with the right skills, tools, and understanding to manage their responsibility effectively? Is our risk framework flexible enough to evolve with changes in our strategy, technology, and regulatory environment? Where do responsibilities overlap between departments, and do those overlaps create gaps, duplication, or opportunities for stronger collaboration? And I'm going to leave you with the final question, which is, if an external regulator walked in tomorrow, would everyone in your organization be able to explain their responsibilities and how they contribute to the achievement of your objectives? Good. Thank you. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you found it useful and something that you can take home with you.
My answer to your last question is no. Yeah. All right. So this has been very, very informative, and I'm really happy that we finally somehow managed to sort this out and schedule this presentation. It's a very important part of every business. It's not just the iGaming industry, it's every business out there. And Andreea, thank you so much for your taking time. Make sure to join us in Prague to meet Andreea in March next year.
Thank you so much for giving me the platform to spread this message, because I think enterprise risk management in itself, it's very important, especially in this very, very unstable landscape that we're facing right now with so many changes from so many directions. We need to be able to analyze them and see how they impact our business and how we can take advantage of them as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrea, once again. And to our audience, make sure to subscribe and follow us. We will be back next week with another important episode. Until then, take good care, everyone. Bye bye.
And that's a wrap for this section of Hipther Talks. Thank you for being a part of our journey today. Don't forget to tune in next week for more insights and discussions. Stay connected with us on Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and more. Until then, keep exploring and keep growing. We'll see you next time.